Every morning before the sun had fully stretched across the sky, a small figure could be seen threading his way through the chaos of Howrah railway station. He wasn't waiting for a train, nor was he lost. He was working. Around his thin wrist, a bundle of bright balloons, red, blue, yellow, green, bobbed gently with each step, like cheerful companions refusing to leave his side. Most travelers barely noticed him. To them, he was just another part of the station's noise, the honking rickshaws, the tea vendors shouting chai garam, and the clatter of suitcases on worn tiles. But if you looked closely, you'd see something different in his eyes. Not sadness, not even exhaustion, but quiet focus. He was only 8 years old, though he carried himself like someone much older. His clothes were clean but patched in places, his sandals cracked from months of walking bare concrete. Every morning he woke before dawn, filled his balloons with air from a hand pump his uncle had given him, tied them carefully with string, and walked the half-mile to the station. Rain or shine, he was there. On sweltering afternoons when the platform shimmered with heat, he'd stand near the shade of a pillar, fanning himself with a torn magazine. On monsoon days, he'd tuck the balloons under his thin shirt to keep them dry, offering them with damp hands and a polite smile. His family lived in a single room tucked behind a row of shuttered shops near the old market. The walls were thin, the roof leaked when it rained hard, and the shared toilet was down a narrow alley that smelled of damp cement and old cooking oil. His mother left before sunrise to clean houses in the richer parts of the city. She came home long after dark, her back aching, her hands rough and red. There was no father in the picture, just rumors, a photo tucked in a drawer, and silence whenever anyone asked. The boy never pressed. He knew better than to add weight to his mother's already heavy shoulders. School was something he loved but couldn't always afford. Not because of fees, he went to a government school where books and uniforms were free, but because time was money. If he spent the day in class, he didn't earn. And without his earnings, there'd be no new shoes when his toes poked through the soles, no medicine when his sister caught a fever, no extra lentils to stretch the evening meal. So he made a quiet deal with himself. Sell balloons in the morning and evening, attend school in between. Some days it worked. Some days it didn't. People often assumed he was begging. He wasn't. He never held out his hand or followed strangers with pleading eyes. Instead, he stood quietly near the ticket counter or the waiting benches, holding up a balloon with a small, hopeful look. 1 rupee, he'd say softly. Most people paid without thinking. Some gave 2 just to see him smile. A few scolded him for being in the way. He never argued. He just stepped aside, adjusted his bundle, and waited for the next person. What surprised those who actually spoke to him wasn't his age or his situation. It was his calmness. He didn't whine. He didn't complain. Once, a woman asked why he wasn't in school that day. He looked down at his sandals, then back up. "My sister's sick. Medicine costs more today." The woman blinked, then handed him a 10-rupee note and walked away without taking a balloon. He ran after her, pressed a balloon into her hand, and said, "You paid for one. You should have one." She stood there stunned as he disappeared back into the crowd. He didn't think of himself as brave or special. He was just doing what needed to be done. At night, after his mother came home and his sister fell asleep on their shared mat, he'd sit by the window and count the day's earnings. Coins clinked softly into an old biscuit tin. Sometimes it was enough for a small treat, a piece of jalebi from the corner stall which he'd split 3 ways the next morning. Other times it barely covered the rent his mother owed their landlord. But he never let the tin sit empty for long. One afternoon, as the sky turned gray and the first drops of monsoon rain began to fall, the station emptied quickly. Travelers scrambled for cover, vendors packed up their carts, and the platform grew quiet except for the drumming of rain on the metal roof. The boy stayed. He tucked the balloons under his shirt, found a dry spot beneath an overhang, and waited. Most days, the rain meant no sales, but he'd learned that sometimes the people who stayed out in the rain were the ones who needed a little color the most. That's when the old man appeared. He wasn't running. He walked slowly, deliberately, in a crisp white kurta that somehow stayed dry despite the downpour. He stopped a few feet away, looked at the boy, then at the small huddle of balloons peeking from under his shirt. Without a word, he pulled out 3 coins and held them out. "For 3, he said. The boy nodded, untied 3 balloons, and handed them over carefully. The man didn't give them to any child. He simply held them by the strings, letting them float above his hand like tiny lanterns. Why balloons? The man asked suddenly. The boy shrugged. They're cheap to buy. People like them. Kids smile. The man studied him for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket again, not for more coins, but for a small folded slip of paper. He pressed it into the boy's palm along with the money. If you ever want to learn something real, he said, voice low but clear over the rain, call this number. Before the boy could ask what he meant, the man turned and walked away, the 3 balloons bobbing behind him like silent flags. The boy stood there, rain dripping from his hair, the paper warm in his hand. He didn't understand it then, but that small piece of paper would soon become the first thread in a story no one at the station could have imagined. For now, though he just tucked it into his pocket, counted his coins, and headed home through the wet streets, balloons long gone but hope still clinging to his fingers like the last drop of rain. Weeks passed, and the folded slip of paper stayed tucked inside the boy's biscuit tin, buried beneath coins and a broken pencil. He didn't forget about it. He thought of it often, especially on days when the station felt louder than usual, or when his math teacher sighed and said, "You're smart, but you're never here enough to keep up." Still, he hesitated, calling a stranger. From a neighbor's phone? What if it was a trick? What if it cost money? His mother had warned him about people who promised big things to children with empty pockets. But one evening, after his sister asked him how clouds stayed up in the sky and he couldn't answer, something shifted. He looked at the tin, then at the paper. Maybe this wasn't about tricks. Maybe it was about answers. The next morning, before heading to the station, he knocked on Mrs. Day's door, the kind widow who lived 2 doors down and sometimes let him use her phone to call the school office. She smiled when she saw him. "Calling your teacher again?" she asked. "No, Dee Dee," he said softly. "Just someone else." She handed him the phone without question. His hands trembled slightly as he dialed the number, each digit feeling heavier than the last. The phone rang once, twice. On the 3rd ring, a calm voice answered. "Yes?" The boy froze for a second. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, You gave me a note. At the station, with balloons." There was a pause, then a quiet chuckle. "Ah, the balloon boy. I wondered if you'd call." That simple sentence, "I wondered if you'd call," made something loosen in his chest. It wasn't pity. It wasn't suspicion. It was expectation. Like the man had believed he might actually reach out. They talked for only a few minutes. The man introduced himself as Mr. Banerjee, a retired teacher who used to work at a college far across the city. He didn't ask for anything. Didn't promise riches. Just said, "If you're curious, come by the banyan tree near the old post office this Saturday. Bring your school books. We'll see what you know and what you don't." Saturday came. The boy washed his only decent shirt, polished his sandals with a rag, and walked the long way to the post office, heart thudding like a drum. Under the wide arms of the ancient banyan tree sat an old man with silver hair, reading glasses perched on his nose, and a cloth bag full of books at his feet. He looked up and smiled. "You came." "I did." And just like that, it began. At first, their meetings were simple. Mr. Banerjee asked him questions about numbers, about the world, about why he thought the sky was blue. The boy stumbled often, but the old man never laughed. Instead, he'd say, "Good. Now you know what you don't know." That's where learning starts. Soon, Saturdays turned into twice a week, then 3 times. The boy would sell balloons in the morning, rush to school, then race to the banyan tree with his notebook clutched tight. Mr. Banerjee taught him fractions using pebbles, explained how trains worked using sticks and string, and once spent an entire afternoon showing him how to track the moon's path across the sky. "Science isn't just in books," he'd say. "It's in everything you touch, everything you see." The boy soaked it all in like dry earth after rain. For the first time, school didn't feel like a chore. It felt like a puzzle he was finally starting to solve. His teachers noticed. His grades climbed. Even his handwriting grew neater, as if his mind had found a rhythm it had been missing. But it wasn't just facts Mr. Banerjee gave him. He taught him how to ask better questions, how to look someone in the eye when he spoke, how to say "I don't know" without shame and then go find the answer. One day, when the boy admitted he was scared he'd never be good enough for college, Mr. Banerjee didn't offer empty comfort. He leaned forward and said, "You don't need to be good enough for them. You need to be curious enough for yourself. That phrase stuck with him. Months passed. Seasons changed. The monsoons returned, then faded into winter. The boy still sold balloons, but now he carried a small notebook in his pocket, scribbling ideas between customers. He started noticing things he never had before. The way water pooled in certain spots on the platform, how different metals felt under his fingers, why some balloons floated longer than others. He asked Mr. Banerjee about all of it. Then came the day of the national science quiz. His school had never entered before, but this year his science teacher, encouraged by his sudden spark, signed him up on a whim. "You might not win," she said gently, "but you'll learn something just by trying." The boy didn't tell Mr. Banerjee at first. He was nervous. What if he embarrassed himself? What if he let everyone down? But the old man found out anyway, probably from the teacher, and simply said, "Then we'll prepare." For 2 weeks, they met every evening. Mr. Banerjee quizzed him on everything from photosynthesis to planetary motion. They used leaves, stones, even teacups to demonstrate concepts. The night before the competition, the boy couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, rehearsing answers in his head, his stomach in knots. The quiz was held in a big auditorium downtown, marble floors, bright lights, kids in crisp uniforms from private schools. He felt out of place in his faded shirt and worn shoes. But when his name was called, he walked to the stage with his head high, remembering Mr. Banerjee's words. Knowledge doesn't care what you wear. He didn't win first place. But he came third, beating dozens of students from schools with labs and libraries and science fairs. When they called his name, the audience clapped politely, unaware that this boy had studied under a tree with pebbles and string. But his teacher cried, and when he got home, his mother held him tight and whispered, "My son." The real victory came a week later. A local newspaper ran a small article. "Street vendor's son shines in National Science Quiz." It wasn't front-page news, but someone saw it, someone who mattered. A man from a youth education nonprofit showed up at the banyan tree one afternoon, looking for the boy who sells balloons. He offered tutoring support, books, even a small scholarship to help cover school costs so the boy could attend more regularly. Mr. Banerjee accepted on his behalf, but only after making the man promise no cameras, no interviews, just help. From then on, things eased just a little. The boy could afford to skip a morning at the station now and then. His sister started doing better in school too, inspired by his quiet determination. And every evening, rain or shine, he still met Mr. Banerjee under the banyan tree. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. One evening, as fireflies blinked in the dusk, the old man closed his book and said, "You're ready for more than I can teach you now." The boy's heart dropped. "Are you stopping?" Mr. Banerjee smiled. "Not stopping. Passing the torch. There are people who can take you further. But remember, no matter how far you go, never forget why you started." The boy didn't fully understand then, but he would, because the next chapter wasn't just about learning anymore. It was about building something of his own, something that would one day roll into his old neighborhood in the quiet hum of electric engines, leaving his family speechless in the driveway. But that was still years away. For now, under the whispering leaves of the banyan tree, a boy with balloon string calluses on his fingers kept turning pages, chasing answers, and quietly stitching together a future no one, not even he, could have predicted. By the time he turned 16, the railway station felt like a memory from another life, even though he still walked past it sometimes just to remember. He didn't sell balloons anymore. Not because he'd forgotten how, but because his hands were busy with something else, sketching, building, testing. His school project that year wasn't like the others. While classmates made posters about the solar system or built basic volcano models, he spent weeks tinkering in a corner of the school's broken-down science lab with plastic bottles, charcoal, sand, and cloth scraps. His goal was simple: clean water. Not for a grade, for home. He'd seen too many kids in his neighborhood fall sick from the tap water, water that sometimes ran brown, sometimes smelled like rust, sometimes made people double over with stomach pain. His own sister had been hospitalized once after drinking it. He'd stood by her bed watching her sleep and promised himself he'd find a way to fix it. Not someday, now. What he built wasn't fancy. It looked like a tall plastic tube with layers inside. Gravel at the bottom, then sand, then crushed charcoal from burnt coconut shells, then a fine cloth filter on top. He'd tested it with dirty pond water from behind the market. After it passed through his device, the water came out clear. He took a small sip carefully, and it tasted like nothing. Just water. Clean water. That night, he cried quietly into his pillow, not from sadness, but from the shock of possibility. His science teacher, the same one who'd signed him up for the quiz years ago, stared at the prototype like it was magic. "Did you really make this yourself?" she asked. He nodded. "I use things anyone can find." She didn't say much then. But 2 days later, she pulled him aside and told him a man from a clean tech incubator would be visiting the school for a youth innovation showcase. "You're entering," she said firmly. No arguments. He spent the next week refining the design, making it smaller, sturdier, easier to assemble. He practiced explaining it in simple words, not textbook jargon. "It's not about being smart," Mr. Banerjee had once told him. "It's about making things useful for real people." So he focused on that, how a family with no money could build this themselves, how it could last months without replacement, how it could save a child from getting sick. The day of the showcase, he set up his display on a wobbly table in the school courtyard. Other projects had flashing lights and digital screens. His had a bucket of muddy water and a clear glass to show the result. At first, people walked by without stopping. Then a man in a neat shirt paused. He looked at the device, then at the boy. "Does it really work?" "Try it," the boy said. The man poured some dirty water in, waited, watched it drip slowly into the glass below. He picked up the glass, sniffed it, then took a cautious sip. His eyes widened. "This is clean." That man was an engineer. And he wasn't just visiting out of curiosity. He worked with a startup that supported young inventors from underserved communities. By the end of the day, he'd taken photos, asked dozens of questions, and left with a promise. "I'll be in touch." He was true to his word. A week later, the boy found himself in a small office downtown, sitting across from the engineer and a woman who ran a social innovation fund. They didn't offer him money right away. Instead, they asked him to test his filter in 3 different neighborhoods over the next month. "If it works as well there as it did here," the woman said, "we'll help you scale it." He didn't sleep much that month. He visited slums, roadside settlements, even a village on the city's edge. He taught mothers how to assemble the filter, watched children drink from it for the first time, collected water samples to test for bacteria. In every place, the results were the same: a dramatic drop in contamination. People started calling it the boy's filter. He hated the name, but he didn't correct them. As long as it helped, the name didn't matter. Back in the office, the data spoke louder than any title. The fund agreed to support him, not with a handout, but with mentorship, lab access, and help filing a provisional patent. "You own this," the woman told him. "We're just helping you protect it so no one else can steal your idea." Filing a patent felt like stepping into another world. Lawyers, forms, technical drawings. He barely understood half of it. But Mr. Banerjee, now in his late 80s but still sharp as ever, sat with him through every meeting, translating legalese into plain sense. "This isn't just paper," the old man said one evening, tapping the patent draft. "This is your voice in a system that usually doesn't listen to boys like you. Make sure it's loud enough." With the patent secured and small-scale production underway, news began to spread. A local TV station did a short piece. A national magazine mentioned him in a feature about young changemakers. Reporters started calling him the balloon inventor, a nickname that made him cringe but also reminded him where he'd come from. Through it all, he stayed in the same small room with his mother and sister. He still ate the same simple meals. He still walked most places. The money he earned from early sales and grants didn't go to new clothes or gadgets. It went to his sister's school fees, his mother's overdue medical checkup, and a proper roof that didn't leak. He bought a second-hand laptop so he could research better materials, but only after his sister got her first new textbook in years. At 19, he stood on a stage again, not for a quiz, but to accept an award for grassroots innovation. The audience was full of investors, professors, and policymakers. When they asked what inspired him, he didn't talk about awards or ambition. He talked about his sister's fever, about the taste of dirty water, about a man who once bought 3 balloons for luck and gave him a chance. After the event, a venture capitalist approached him. "We can make this big," he said, "global. But you'll need to move fast, think big." Maybe even leave the local work behind for a while. The boy listened politely. Then he said, "I'm not building a company to get rich. I'm building it so no child has to choose between drinking water and getting sick." The man blinked, then nodded slowly. "Then you're exactly the kind of founder we need." By the time he turned 20, his filter was being used in over 200 villages. Local women were trained to assemble and sell them, creating jobs as well as clean water. He never took a salary bigger than what his mother once earned cleaning floors. "If I live like them," he told a friend once, "I'll never forget why I started." And though luxury cars and headlines were still far off, something quieter was already happening. Hope, flowing like clean water through places that had long been dry. 5 years had passed since the day he stood in a school courtyard with a bucket of muddy water and a plastic tube held together by hope. Now he sat in the passenger seat of a sleek, silent car, electric, smooth, and so quiet it felt like gliding on air. The city outside the window was the same, yet everything felt different. The streets were busier, the buildings taller, the noise louder. But inside the car there was calm. Not the kind that comes from wealth, but the kind that comes from knowing you've kept your word. To yourself, to your family, to the boy you used to be. He hadn't planned to come home like this. In fact, he'd avoided it for months. Not out of shame, but out of fear. Fear that success might look like distance, that comfort might feel like betrayal. He still remembered the smell of wet cement in their old room, the sound of his mother coughing through the night, the way his sister used to share her single roti with him without saying a word. How could he show up in a car like this and not feel like he'd left all that behind? But today wasn't about him. It was about them. The car slowed as it turned onto the narrow lane where his family still lived, though not in the same crumbling room anymore. Thanks to his steady support over the years, they'd moved to a small but solid apartment just 3 blocks away. Clean walls, a proper kitchen, a balcony where his mother now grew marigolds in old paint cans. He'd arranged all of it quietly, never making a show. But today he wasn't coming quietly. He stepped out of the car, the morning sun glinting off its smooth surface. Within minutes, neighbors began peeking out of windows. Whispers rippled down the lane. "Is that him? The balloon boy? But that car, it must cost more than our whole building." He didn't smile for show. He just walked to the door and knocked. His mother opened it, wiping her hands on her sari, expecting a delivery or a neighbor. When she saw him, her eyes widened. Not at the car behind him, but at the look in his eyes. She knew that look. It was the same one he'd had the day he brought home his first science prize. Proud, but careful not to let it show too much. "Why didn't you call?" she asked, voice trembling just slightly. "I wanted it to be a surprise," he said gently. Then 2 more cars turned the corner. Both luxury models, both electric, both gleaming under the Kolkata sun. One was deep blue, the other a soft silver. They rolled to a stop right in front of the building. A small crowd had already gathered. Children pointed. Old men squinted. Someone muttered, "Did he win the lottery?" He turned to his mother. "These aren't for me," he said. "One's for you. One's for Dee Dee." His sister, now in her 2nd year of college studying education, came running out, her books clutched to her chest. She stopped short when she saw the cars, then looked at him like he'd grown a second head. "You can't be serious," she whispered. "I am," he said. "You've been taking the bus for hours every day. You deserve better, and Ma, you've walked so far for so long. It's time someone drove you." His mother didn't cry. She never did in front of others. But she touched the hood of the blue car like it was made of glass, then turned and hugged him so tightly he could feel her heartbeat. But the real surprise wasn't waiting in the driveway. It was around the corner. Later that afternoon, he walked his family down the familiar alley to their old neighborhood. The building where they'd once lived was still there, but it looked different. Fresh paint, new windows. A sign above the entrance that read, "Sunrise Learning Center, free after-school support for children of daily wage workers." His sister gasped. You bought this?" He nodded. "I didn't just want to give cars. I wanted to give chances." Inside, the space was bright and airy. Small desks, shelves full of books, a whiteboard with math problems still written on it. A young woman, barely older than him, was helping a group of kids with their homework. She looked up, recognized him, and smiled. "They've been waiting for you," she said. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. Yet somehow the children knew. Maybe word had spread with the cars. Maybe hope has its own kind of speed. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in oranges and purples, he stood on the old railway platform. Not to sell, not to wait, but to give. In his arms, he carried a stack of notebooks, pencils, and storybooks. Word had gone out. Free books for any child who came with a question. Not a purchase. Just curiosity. At first, only a few approached, shy, unsure. But when they saw him kneel to their level, listen to their questions, and hand them a book with a real smile, more came. Soon, a small circle formed around him. He read a story about stars. Explained why rainbows happen. Promised to come back next week with more books. And maybe a simple experiment they could all try together. A station guard who'd known him since he was knee-high watched from a distance, shaking his head. "That boy," he muttered to a colleague. He left with balloons, came back with books. Back at the apartment over a simple dinner of dal and rice, his mother finally asked the question she'd been holding in all day. "Are you happy?" He thought for a long moment. Not about money, not about fame, not about the cars parked outside. He thought about the girl who'd asked him how clouds float. The boy who'd whispered, "Will this help my little brother not get sick?" The old man under the banyan tree who'd believed in him before he believed in himself. "Yes, Ma," he said softly. "I'm happy, because I haven't become someone else. I've just become more of who I always was." And in that quiet room, filled with the smell of home-cooked food and the sound of his sister laughing over a college story, he knew he'd finally come all the way back. Not as a stranger in a luxury car, but as a son, a brother, and a boy who never forgot where his journey began. Years had passed since the day he stood on the railway platform handing out books instead of balloons, but the banyan tree near the old post office hadn't changed much. Its roots still curled over the sidewalk like wise old fingers. Its leaves still whispered secrets to anyone who sat beneath them long enough to listen. And there he was again, older now, shoulders broader, hair a little shorter, but the same calm in his eyes, the same quiet way of sitting like he belonged exactly where he was. Around him, a small group of children sat cross-legged on woven mats, their notebooks open, pencils gripped tight. Some wore school uniforms with frayed hems. Others wore hand-me-downs 2 sizes too big. But all of them leaned forward when he spoke, as if his words carried something heavier than just lessons. He wasn't teaching them equations or chemical formulas today. He was showing them how to build a simple solar dryer using cardboard, black paint, and clear plastic. Something they could use to preserve fruits or herbs for their families. "It's not about fancy tools," he said, cutting a piece of cardboard with careful hands. "It's about using what you have to solve what hurts." One boy raised his hand. "Will this really work?" he smiled. "Only one way to find out. Try it." That was his rule now. Never tell them something works. Show them how to test it themselves. Because knowledge given is soon forgotten. Knowledge earned sticks like glue. His company had grown far beyond the water filter now. It employed dozens of people, most of them from neighborhoods just like the one he grew up in. They designed low-cost solar lamps, composting toilets, even a pedal-powered grain mill for villages without electricity. Investors called it a social enterprise. He just called it responsibility. Reporters still asked him the same question. How did a boy who sold balloons end up leading a company worth millions? He never gave the dramatic answer they wanted. No rags to riches theatrics, no villainous struggles. Just truth, plain and simple. Someone saw me before I saw myself, and I promised I'd do the same for others. He didn't live in a mansion, didn't fly first class unless it was for work. His home was modest, a small apartment near the learning center, filled with books, plants, and a single framed photo of Mr. Banerjee, who'd passed peacefully in his sleep 3 winters ago, surrounded by students whose lives he'd quietly changed. On the wall beside the photo hung a faded red balloon, dry, brittle, but still intact. A reminder. Every Sunday without fail he returned to the banyan tree, not because he had to, but because it grounded him. Here he wasn't a founder or a CEO. He was just a teacher, just a listener, just someone who remembered what it felt like to be invisible. One evening, as the sky turned the color of ripe mangoes, a young girl tugged at his sleeve. "Did you really sell balloons here?" she asked, eyes wide. He nodded. "Right over there near the ticket counter. Why'd you stop?" "Because I found something better to sell," he said gently. "What's that?" "Hope," he replied. "But you don't sell it." You give it away. She frowned, trying to understand. He didn't explain further. Some things can't be taught in a sentence. They have to be lived. Later that night, long after the children had gone home and the streetlights flickered on, he walked back toward the railway station. Not out of nostalgia, but habit. The place still pulsed with life. The same shouts of vendors, the same clatter of trains, the same tide of people rushing somewhere important. And among them, he saw them. New boys and girls, small and serious, selling flowers, tissues, or packets of peanuts. Some looked tired. Some looked determined. All of them looked familiar. He slowed his steps. Didn't stop. Didn't hand out money. But if one of them caught his eye, if they looked up with that same quiet focus he once had, he'd give a small nod. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it was everything. Back in his car, a modest electric sedan, not the luxury model from years ago, he drove past his old neighborhood. The learning center was still open, lights glowing warmly through the windows. Inside, teenagers were studying for exams. Younger kids were drawing, and a volunteer was reading aloud from a storybook. He watched for a moment, then drove on. His phone buzzed. A message from his sister. Dee Dee's school got funding for a new science lab. She says it's because of you. He smiled but didn't reply right away. It wasn't because of him. It was because someone once believed a boy with balloons could learn, and because that boy refused to let that belief go to waste. Now, he made sure it multiplied. He'd started a mentorship program pairing successful professionals with kids from the streets, engineers with future builders, doctors with curious minds, teachers with quiet dreamers. No cameras, no press. Just real people showing up for real reasons. Talent is everywhere, he often said. Opportunity isn't. Let's fix that. And slowly, quietly they were one rainy afternoon. Much like the day he'd met Mr. Banerjee, he sat under the banyan tree with a new student, a shy boy who barely spoke but loved fixing broken radios. As rain pattered on the leaves above, the boy held out a small device he'd repaired using spare parts from an old toy. Will it work? He asked nervously. He took it, turned the knob, and static crackled, then music. A soft old song drifting through the downpour like a memory. It works, he said, handing it back. Now go show your mother. The boy beamed and ran off, clutching the radio like treasure. He stayed under the tree a while longer, listening to the rain, the distant train whistle, the hum of the city breathing around him. He thought of all the hands that had helped him, his mother's worn fingers counting coins, Mr. Banerjee's steady guidance, the engineer who saw potential in a plastic tube, the neighbors who lent him a phone when he was too scared to ask. He hadn't done any of it alone, and he never wanted anyone else to have to. So he kept showing up, kept listening, kept giving chances, not because he had extra, but because he remembered what it felt like to have none. And sometimes late at night, when the city finally quieted and the stars blinked through the smog, he'd sit on his balcony, look toward the railway station in the distance, and whisper a quiet thank you, not to fate, not to luck, but to the ordinary people who did extraordinary things by simply seeing a child and saying, "You matter." That, more than any car or company or headline, was the real story. Not how he rose, but how he reached back. Not what he gained, but what he gave away. And as long as there were children selling dreams on street corners for a rupee, he'd be there. Not to rescue them, but to remind them. You already have everything you need. You just need someone to believe it first.